And today's event is actually co-sponsored by the Edmonton Small Press Association. The ESPA is a non-profit organization and would be extremely grateful for a donation to offset the cost of the event. To give some information about this week is organized by the graduate student of the Global Education Network and the Palestine Solidarity Network in Edmonton. And the International Apartheid Week actually began in Toronto in 2005, and it became one of the most important global events in the Palestine Solidarity calendar. This year, International Apartheid Week events are happening in a dozen cities across Canada and more than 40 around the world, including a number of cities within Palestine. This week's events are intended to raise awareness on the university campus about the human rights issues affecting the Palestinian people and offer ways for students and Edmontonians in the broader community to act in solidarity with them. So before I introduce tonight's moderator, I would like to make a few short comments. The organizers feel that it is important to recognize that as we gather this week to assert our opposition to apartheid and our solidarity with struggles for dignity and self-determination in Palestine, we feel we cannot speak meaningfully about Israeli apartheid without acknowledging the realities of apartheid here in Canada. Canada's reservation system and treatment of indigenous people was closely studied by the planners of apartheid in South Africa, though this is hidden from our chapter in history. We also feel that it is important to recognize that Israeli Apartheid Week events across Canada have been stifled by censorship on the part of certain university administrations. At University of Ottawa and Carleton University, IAW posters were banned, and at York University, the student group organizing IAW events was suspended, preventing this week from happening. Here on campus, individuals or groups opposed to the issues we are discussing systematically and repeatedly tore down posters advertising this week's event. However, we would like to acknowledge that despite extensive and organized pressure from some group to prevent Israeli Apartheid Week from happening, the University of Alberta has remained committed to principles of academic freedom and discourse on this important issue, and for that they should be commended. Finally, in the interest of having an open dialogue, we would like to stress that the organizers of the event urge all participants to engage on this issue in a respectful manner. We categorically reject and will not in any way tolerate instances of Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, or other racist behavior during this week's event. So having said all of this, I would like to introduce Dr. Tony Simmons. Dr. Tony Simmons is an associate professor of sociology at the Center of Global and Social Analysis at the Athabasca University. Tony's area of interest are classical and contemporary social theory, postmodernism, Marxism and critical theory, organizational theory along with the philosophy and history of science. He is the joint author of Reading Organizational Theory and is presently working on two other books, Revitalizing the Classics, a contemporary guide to classic social theory, and A Square Peg in a Round Hole, Memoir of a Distant Educator. So thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Palestine Solidarity Committee for inviting me to contribute to tonight. I appreciate the chance to support this action, and I'd like to congratulate the committee on all the hard work that it's put in for what appears to be a very successful week. I'd also like to thank everyone who came here tonight to show their support and their interest in some of these issues. My name is Tony Simmons, and I was asked before we open up this meeting for general discussion, questions and concerns, if I would take a couple of minutes to briefly discuss my thoughts on how these issues relate to Canadians and to Canada. And so what I'd like to do in a couple of minutes before we open up, I'd like to address myself basically to two things. Firstly, how does the issue of the brutal military occupation of Palestinian lands and the maintenance of an apartheid system against Palestinians both in the occupied territories and in Israel itself relate to Canada? And secondly, I would then briefly like to address what is it that Canadians can do to support the struggle of Palestinian people for their rights and their national self-determination. So I don't want to impose myself too much on you. I'll try and run through my thoughts as quickly as I can, and hopefully I won't be too incoherent. I also brought along some literature which kind of repeats some of the things I'm very quickly about to say. If anyone is interested enough to pick that up afterwards, please, I invite you to do so. So the first question is, what do these issues have to do with Canadians? And I have been, in a sense, a veteran of the anti-apartheid movement for, I guess, over 30 years. I've been arrested in Ireland, in England, and, believe it or not, in Canada in 1977 for direct actions that we had in support of the African National Congress in its struggle against the apartheid system. So what I'd like to suggest to you, first of all, and I think for me this is very important, that if we look at the facts over the past 10 to 15 years, they demonstrate that the Canadian government is building an increasingly closer military and trading partnership with the State of Israel. What are the facts which I can use to support that? Well, one very important fact, 1995, is when the Canadian government decided to lift the arms embargo, which had formerly been imposed on Israel. And that embargo was lifted in 1995, largely to encourage the peace process, the Oslo Accords, and to reward Israel for participating in those processes. So the lifting of the arms embargo, for reasons that I'll discuss in a minute, was very important. And then 2 years later, in 1997, we see the signing of the Canada-Israel Free Trade Association, a free trade agreement. In other words, a free trade agreement between Canada and Israel, the only such agreement that Canada has ever signed outside of this hemisphere. And why it would have signed with Israel is an interesting question. But the other more, in my opinion, more odious aspect to the free trade agreement between Canada and Israel is that it differs from the kind of free trade agreement that the European Union has with Israel. Because when European countries signed a free trade agreement, they made absolutely sure that the free trade area was only within the state of Israel itself. But if you actually study the provisions of the Canadian free trade agreement with Israel, it actually applies to so-called land of Israel where the customs and traditions of Israel are maintained. And that, we know, means the occupied territories. So the upshot of all this is, in your grocery stores, you can easily find, particularly in Eastern Canada, goods and products which have actually been grown on the West Bank or in the occupied territories by the settlers themselves, unlawful settlers, as we know, in contravention of the Fourth Geneva Convention. But these are protected and privileged products under the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. In Europe, they make a sharp distinction. They try to monitor and to exclude products which have come from the illegal settlements in the occupied territories. So 1997, the Canada Free Trade Agreement, Israel Free Trade Agreement, which brings us to 2004, where we start to see the results of the arms embargo being lifted and the Free Trade Agreement, because the Canadian government, the Canadian Armed Forces, started to sign some multi-million-dollar contracts with a company called El Isra, and this was basically for helicopter combat systems which the Canadian Air Force wanted to use in Afghanistan. So we see that whole project being upgraded, and we see the entrance into Canada of the Magal Systems company, which operates, it's an Israeli company which operates in Canada under the name of Senstar Stella. And Magal specializes in the construction of surveillance and security equipment, which is used in penitentiaries, which is used in airports and other high security areas. It specializes in surveillance and security of secure perimeters for the most part. So Corrections Canada apparently has entered into 27 different agreements with this procurement part of the government to equip Canadian prisons and penitentiaries with security material bought through the McGall Corporation. So 2004, 2005, and I may be telling you some things that you already know, I'm not sure, but 2005 was an interesting year because for the first time, Israeli F-16 bombers participated in Cold Lake in NATO training exercises, so-called Maple Leaf exercises in Cold Lake, Alberta. Now, Israel is not a member of NATO, as you know, but there are clear indications that Israel would like to become a member of NATO. And it has its backers, and some of those backers are highly placed within the United States and perhaps in Canada as well. So 2005, we saw Israeli fighter planes up in Cold Lake, about 15 to 20 F-16s. And we know that Canadian auxiliaries like General Dynamics manufacture parts for F-15 and F-16 fighter bombers. They manufacture flight simulation recorders and things of this nature. And so there is within the Western war machine, as I like to call it, which is in NATO and its associated countries, it's not simply a security organization, but it's very much an economic and market organization. There's a lot of arms trading and so on, which goes on within that area as well. So 2005, the Maple Leaf exercises with Israel at Cold Lake. 2006 was an interesting year because it saw the first of a number of subsequent bilateral agreements between provinces in Canada and the State of Israel. The one I'm referring to is between the province of Manitoba and the Ministry of Agriculture in Israel for water conservation research and applications of that nature. And this was a project which was pushed by the Jewish National Fund in Canada, which succeeded in bringing together interested parties in the province of Manitoba and the Ministry of Agriculture in Israel. And another concern that many of us would have is the so-called water conservation projects used in Israel are frequently part of illegal diversion of water from the Jordan River, from the West Bank, and from other parts, and the rationing of water in such a way as Palestinians, even on their own land, receive very little of the water diversion. Much of it goes to the illegal settlements as well. So 2006, and there are several other such partnerships between provinces in Canada and the Israeli government. They exist also in Quebec and Ontario, and I haven't kept up with blossoming of these different, and probably in Alberta as well. So 2008, which brings us much closer to home, we see, and my point in all of this is there is evidence for an increasingly closer military and trading relationship between the two countries. That's the point I'm trying to make. So 2008, and you can check all I'm saying through Google it or look into independent sources. 2008, the Ministry of External Affairs in Canada decided, for reasons best known to itself, to drop Israel and the United States from its list of countries which practice torture in prisons and penitentiaries overseas. The Department of External Affairs has a manual in which it keeps tabs of all the countries which are alleged on the basis of information from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and so on and so forth, which routinely practice torture. And anyone who knows anything about the treatment of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails would be dumbfounded to know that the Department of External Affairs decided to drop. And anyone who knows anything about Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib would be equally dumbfounded to know why the United States should be dropped as well. But it seemed to be an increasing trend of the Harper government. And Harper shouldn't only be demonized for this, because Paul Martin government began with the arms embargo and then the Free Trade Association. But under Harper, the partnership has become closer and more emphasized. So in 2008, then, we see the dropping of the torture. We also see in 2008 another very significant development, which was the signing of the so-called Public Safety Cooperation Agreement, which was signed, first of all, in Tel Aviv by Stockwell Day, when he was still Minister of Public Safety. And then the Israeli officials came to Ottawa in November of 2008 to ratify what had originally been a declaration of intent. So this public safety or public security, as it's known in Israel, a cooperation agreement, has never been introduced into the House of Commons. It's never been really debated, and it should be, because it puts together a number of different agencies, both in Israel and in Canada. Here it's the Border Services Agency, the RCMP, various police forces, CSIS, and so on and so forth, and their equivalents in Israel, along with Mossad and Shin Bet, and their other secret service organizations. Does it mean that information can be routinely passed between Canada and Israel, particularly on aircraft flights? Will people be racially profiled and that information made readily available to both countries? I don't know, because the issues have never been adequately discussed. They've never been given a proper hearing, and they should be, because this really, in a sense, increasingly commits Canadians to what is an increasingly close partnership. And you don't get any closer when you talk about security issues. That's very close indeed, particularly the exchange of information. So the Public Safety Cooperation Agreement, originally signed in Tel Aviv, April 2008, ratified in Ottawa, November 2008. What else happened in 2008? Another thing which happened, and this is important, in November, as I recall, was Canada had delivered the first Heron drone, or unmanned aerial vehicle. A drone, as you know, is a pilotless plane which is used in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and certainly in the Palestinian areas. It can set coordinates for military attacks with tremendous accuracy. So these are killer drones, in a sense. And the Canadian Armed Forces had been after a fleet of these for a long time, and has set up a program which has the cumbersome name, the acronym of JUSTAS, J-U-S-T-A-S, which means Joint Unmanned Surveillance Target Acquisition System, I think. You can check it yourself. But what it is a research and implementation project to develop a fleet of these drones. They're very expensive. Why is that of interest to Canadians? Because the drones, the actual model of the drone is built in Israel by Israel Aerospace Industries. And it's manufactured in this country in association with McDonald Detweiler Associates, MDA. Those two companies, the Israeli company and the British Columbia company in Richmond, McDonald Detweiler, are working together on the provision of the Canadian Armed Forces of these unmanned aerial vehicles, these drones. And the first Heron, as it's known as, was delivered, I think, in November 2008. So that's another example of how military and security issues have come together with the free trade issues and have increasingly committed Canada to a partnership which is becoming closer and closer. The other thing I should mention is in 2008, the Israeli Navy was invited to participate in NATO naval training exercises in the Black Sea area. It was known as Cooperation MAKO, M-A-K-O. The first time, to my knowledge, that the Israeli Navy has ever been formally integrated for training exercises with a NATO training exercise. And the other thing which I thought was of interest in 2008 was the small village of Bilin, B-I-L-I-N, in the occupied territories, a Palestinian village, tried to bring to court two Canadian companies that were building on illegal settlements, that were building settlement houses on areas which which in the occupied areas, which of course Canadian companies are not supposed to do because they are violating the Fourth Geneva Convention. The two companies were known as Green Park International and Green Mount International. And the Palestinian village succeeded in bringing this matter to the attention of the Quebec Superior Court, because both of these Canadian companies are licensed in the province of Quebec. And I wish I could tell you I knew what the outcome of those hearings has been. I'm not sure if it's gone to trial yet, and that will be, I think, a responsibility I have to try and bring myself up to date. But it is true that Berlin succeeded in getting this matter taken to a Canadian court, and the Israeli kind of front organization, B'nai B'rith, dismissed this, I think, in a recent statement by saying it was a very trivial and insubstantial matter to bring to the Canadian courts, but not, obviously not for the Palestinians themselves, who are seeing their own land successfully eroded and stolen right under their very eyes. So 2009 sees, of course, the very shameful vote that the Canadian government had in the United Nations Human Rights Committee, where by itself alone it refused to condemn these horrific attacks in Gaza. And I think that was a shameful day for all of us who have any concern for human life and for, in some sense, protecting a community which is largely defensive. The other thing which came to my mind the other day, which I don't think many of us would know, is that after these attacks happened in Gaza, the government of Venezuela did what I think our government should have done, which was to expel the Israeli ambassador. And within 1 week, the Canadian embassy in Caracas announced that it was now taking over to represent Israeli interests in the state of Venezuela. How many people know that? I was dumbfounded by that. This is the degree of intimacy that the Harper government appears to be interested in cultivating with the government of Israel at the moment. So my first point in all this build-up is, I'm not sure how many of us realize how close a groundwork is actually being formed right now to develop this intimate military and trading relationship and partnership between Israel and Canada. Before we can do anything at all about it, we have to know the facts. And researching these facts is something that anti-apartheid organizations take very seriously. So that's the first issue I wanted to bring to your attention, my belief that there is an agenda, and the agenda is to bring a much closer partnership with Israel. And this, of course, is looked favorably upon by the United States because, as Henry Kissinger said a long time ago, Israel is our watchdog in the Middle East. So my second quick point, and I can see...
You said you were going to talk for a couple of minutes?
Sorry. Do you want me to shut up?
I'm just requesting, are we going to have an open...
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
absolutely.
Can we do it soon, please?
Yeah, okay. Real fast. So what do we do about it? Okay, I'd just like to bring to your attention, if we're interested in sanctions, then there are at least several types of sanctions. Political sanctions. Repeal the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement. That would be a sanction. Repeal the Public Safety and Security Cooperation Agreement. That will be a political sanction. Economic sanctions or trading sanctions. As far as Canada is concerned, that will be in three main areas. Arms, and I've spoken about arms already with El Isra, the Israeli aerospace industries. So putting an end to the arms trade would be, I think, a big step forward. Secondly, energy. How many people realize that Israeli companies are active in the Athabasca oil sands? There are at least two major projects which are going on under the auspices of the Ormat Industries, which operates in Canada under the name of Opti Canada. There's two plants. One of them is close to the small Aboriginal village of Anzac, and the other is the Long Lake South, which is about 45 miles south of Fort McMurray. And the interesting thing is that both of these plants are engaged in what's known as direct energy recovery or cogeneration, which is trying to produce oil from shale and bitumen, which is, in a sense, the most ecologically unprogressive way to do it. The carbon footprint left by that technology is about 8 to 10 times greater than the extraction of conventional crude. And of course, Israel is very interested in developing this technology for the Negev desert and for other areas because it doesn't have the supplies of oil that its neighboring countries do. And it just occurred to me, and I am finishing off now, that the policies of the Israeli government, which have been so tyrannical and so oppressive for Palestinians, in a sense have ecological consequences. Because if Israel respected the rights of Palestinians and endorsed the right of the Palestinian people to have their own state and had a democratic organization, then it could buy oil from presumably its neighboring countries and would not have to upgrade in this filthy way that this kind of technology requires through shale and through bitumen, gravity steam technology. So regressive politics leads to regressive ecological policies as well. That's my point. Okay, I'll shut up and open up.